Thank you specifically to the board members who are joining to take your time out of your day to understand how to keep remote staff motivated and engaged and happy and comfortable in these very uncomfortable times. And for the executive directors and leaders and HR folks who are here, thank you to you as well for joining. We're very excited to have Cynthia Rojas with us this morning. We started talking about this as a very different session. It was really just, how to keep clients engaged, and it turned much more into a session where we needed to talk about care, and that's for motivation. So I will let Cynthia get into the details of that. Thank you for joining us. As we will keep you muted, but you please do feel free to ask questions, and Cynthia will give you the protocol for how we're going to do that. We have other sessions coming up that you may be interested in. Just want to do the commercial for what we have coming up. We do have a lot of work that we're going to be doing this fall on implicit bias and racial injustice. So we're going to be doing two keynote speeches. One with Mara Gottlieb on October 28th, 90 minutes. And we'll be doing one with Kenya Rutland on November 5th, also a 90-minute presentation. And then Kenya and Mara and Rosida Morales Rosario will be doing series where we ask board and staff teams to come, at least 2, up to 4 people to come in to work with those consultants on a series of workshops that will really unpack implicit bias and microaggressions and how we're dealing with racism with ourselves and with our organizations, and how we can start building anti-racism into our organization to be part of a systemic change. So, and we will also, with each of those series of workshops, offer one-on-one consultation to help your organization and the leaders who attended those sessions create a plan for making it organization-wide and working with your staff and remaining board to understand the concepts and to start making change within your organization. We know that everyone's in a different place starting their journey. It's a journey, it's not a session and I've got it done. So we hope you will join us for one of those series and one or both of the keynote speeches as we're coming up. We also have a 2-part strategic alliance workshop coming up. And in between, there is a lot of work that an organization has to do. So you have to be primed and ready to start thinking seriously about strategic alliance. If you join this workshop, you can listen in for informational purposes. But if you want one of the consultations of the work in between, you really have to be ready to engage and get the work done in that time period. I don't want to take any more time for commercials because I know Cynthia has so much to get through this morning. We are grateful to have her with us. So Cynthia, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I so appreciate that. And welcome, everybody. I am so excited to wake up and talk about motivation. I am slowly losing my voice, but I wouldn't have missed this for anything. So if you can tolerate the weirdness, I can tolerate talking through it. So thank you. Thank you so much. I am Cynthia Rojas, and I am a consultant with Field Partners. And so at Field, we help leaders make better decisions. The team at Field specializes in strategic business planning, organizational culture, research, climate surveys, strategic alliances, and trainings, including evaluation and research. And so we offer a customized consulting experience that guides your organization through an information-rich process that supports leaders in making sometimes very hard decisions. And we have office in the state of Connecticut and Rhode Island. All right, so let's get right to it. What do we hope to accomplish today? Well, it is my hope that you understand what truly drives motivation. And when I learned what drives motivation, it changed the way I led my staff. And so I'm excited to talk about that. Also, we can't talk about motivation or anything that's happening these days without putting the context of our workforce into the conversation. So we are really going to look at how things have changed and why that's impacting motivation of our staff. Then we're going to have an opportunity to hear from 2 organizations who are doing wonderful work in motivating their staff. And then my hope is that you walk away with some tools in how to manage remote staff during these times, which is a little different from all the research we see on managing remote staff during any other time. Okay, so we're gonna get right into it. I wanted to find motivation so that we are all on the same page. Motivation is having the enthusiasm and drive to do something. It is an essential part of being productive, meaning without motivation, we tend to procrastinate and simply or just blow things off. So motivation becomes a really important factor in productivity. What do we know about motivation? Well, psychologists, neurobiologists, and researchers have been looking at motivation for a really long time. And so there is some pretty solid research that's telling us that motivation is rooted in our striatum, which is the part of the brain which relays information between our prefrontal cortex, which is the front of the brain, and that part of the brain manages decisions, and the basal ganglia, which works with our movement and our emotion. This is important in motivation, right? And so what we found is that the stratum is also activated by feelings of expectation and excitement. So this is important. The same part of the brain that's feeding information about decisions is also regulating your moods and your emotions as it relates to expectation. The anticipation of an outcome of a choice that you are making has been found to be joined by excitement. So, what that means is the mere act of choosing something highlights the part of your brain and gets it excited, which is also in charge of movement and is in charge of your mood. So, all of this comes together. And so, neurobiologists believe that the stratum then helps translate decisions into actions. At the end of the day, what researchers tend to agree on is that choice making is about is about control. And so we're going to spend some time talking about that because that's really important when it comes to motivation. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was younger or a newer leader, I would think that people were born with certain levels of motivation. This is why this person is more successful than the other person. It's not true. What we are finding is that, in fact, motivation has a true physiological component to it that starts in our brain. What we're also finding through researchers is that motivation is a skill that you can learn. My God, I feel like I could breathe a sigh of relief, right? It's not something that you're born with, it is something that you get to exercise. And so it's almost like a muscle in your body that when you exercise and the right way, it gets bigger. The same thing with motivation. When it's practiced the right way, you can actually increase self motivation. But as leaders who are struggling with keeping their staff motivated, you can also help them work that muscle. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So, the way to do this, to exercise this muscle, is to believe that you truly have the authority over your actions and your environment, right? Motivation is linked to control. And so, in order to motivate ourselves, we must feel like we are in control. This is really important during the pandemic. So, that means that there are two prerequisites to motivation, right? And one of them is a belief that we are in control. And the control is defined through choice making. Remember, this part of the brain that gets information from your prefrontal cortex is making decisions. When you have choices to make, those decisions, you are more likely to be motivated. We know that the feeling of control also gives us confidence. It increases our drive. It makes us more willing to push our limits. And so, which are all the things leaders want of their staff. So, as we mentioned before, when we feel in control, we experience increased activity in the stratum, the area of our brain that drives motivation. But sometimes we don't like the choices in front of us, right? And so that's when the second prerequisite comes into play. When you don't like the choices in front of you and none of them are motivating you, that's when we need to tap into what what is the significance of our choices, or what is the significance of our task. And then we need to search for meaning in our choices. So, for example, if you're confronted with 5 tasks and you don't like to do any of them, one of the best things for you to do is to figure out which one is going to give you the greatest impact, or which one's going to make you feel better at the end of the day because you have done it. So finding meaning, which one is related to your personal mission and is important to you. So what's this talk about generating a sense of control? Charles Duhigg wrote 2 books, and one of them, which is where I got a lot of this information from, if you're interested in reading more about it, he spends a very small amount of time on the biology of motivation and spends a lot of time on execution. But in his book, Smarter, Faster, Better, he explains these concepts about motivation. He also wrote a book on habits called The Power of Habits, and he talks about forming good habits and getting rid of bad habits. And in these 2 books, he talks about the sense of, of, of control that we need. One of them is the ability to choose, right? So even small choice making affect our motivation. And he gives this example of email. You know, if you are at a point in your career where you are so done with email because it is so overwhelming, sometimes the sense of control comes from your decision to only answer 3 emails in this one time of the day. And it's going to be 3 emails that you can answer right away and get out of your inbox, right? So that's a choice that you're making. And that tends to motivate you to at least accomplish those 3 emails. So even when the choice making is very small, it is still impactful when it comes to motivation. The other thing that Duhigg talks about is making subversive choices. So this is funny. This is about breaking rules, right? Or challenging the status quo. And when we do that, we feel more in control. We see it with young kids. When they learn about breaking rules or saying no, it is all they want to do because they are motivated by this feeling of being in control. And so people who tend not to break rules struggle with this concept. And but the more subversive choices you make, greater your internal locus of control, the greater the motivation to complete your task. So I'm going to tell you a short story because I happen to be one of those people who does not break rules, right? I like rules. I like order. I like structure. And so there's all this literature about working from home, and you shouldn't do laundry in the middle of the day, or you shouldn't run an errand in the middle of the day because it messes with your mojo, whatever. And the truth is, I follow those rules. But I also have this problem. I don't like going food shopping. I feel like I'm always in the supermarket. I eat and cook every meal at home, and I'm always running out of food. And yesterday, believe it or not, I got up in the middle of my day and said, I'm going food shopping. I was sick and tired of not having food in the house. And then at the end of the day, I'm too tired to go food shopping. I don't know if many of you can relate to this. This is funny that my rule breaking is going to the supermarket. But I have to tell you something that happened. So I went to the supermarket. Sorry. I knew what I wanted to get. I went through up and down the aisles. I got everything. I packed it. I came home. I unpacked it. And I felt so accomplished. And I felt there was a part of me that had that jovial feeling when we know we do something bad. And I went back to the office, to my desk, and started working. And I was working harder. And that was because I had this amazing feeling about me that I was able to break a rule and get something accomplished. We're going to talk about rule breaking later, but I invite you to start thinking in your leadership when your staff start breaking rules, to think about how this is helping them find their internal locus of control. Finding the second prerequisite we talked about was finding meaning in your choices, right? Because sometimes the choice is not enough. For example, if my day consisted of checking emails, completing a report that was overdue, having a difficult conversation about performance, and going food shopping, I got to tell you, none of that gets me out of bed. And on top of that, add some rain to the weather, and I just want to put the covers over me. So, talk about lack of motivation. And so, what Charles advises in both of his books is that when you're not motivated to do any of these, you want to think about why. Why is this important? What's the higher purpose? What's the bigger picture here? So if I were confronted with these four choices, checking emails, completing a report, having a difficult conversation, and going food shopping, I would choose number three. I would choose to have the difficult conversation. Why? Because to me, that is far more meaningful in terms of accomplishment and outcome than the others. I am really invested in my staff. And if I'm having a staff person that's having trouble and needs my help, then I'm going to want to talk to that person and I'm going to want to listen. And so attaching a higher purpose to your choice then motivates you to get that accomplished. So then we had a pandemic. And this is why so many of us are feeling a lack of motivation. When the pandemic first, I spent a lot of time talking to leaders and to staff, and I was asking individuals about what it was like for them to work from home. In one conversation, somebody stopped me and said, Cynthia, you're making a really bad assumption. No one here is choosing to work remotely. We didn't choose to work from home. Our world was disrupted and forced us to leave our offices. And I'm thankful for that person because it helped me reframe all of this. We lost our choice making during the pandemic. And if you remember, choice making is attached to motivation. And that is the problem that we're trying to deal with now, especially as we go into the long term. So, what did we lose? Well, we lost our workplace. And for some people, that was a haven. I loved going into the office, I love my colleagues. And that became very difficult for me to go one day from having this great team I was a part of that we laughed and we ate together, we talked about food, to not having them next to me anymore. We also lost schools and childcare, which meant that parents now have to become teachers and they are, or because they're homeschooling, or they have to, I just lost my train of thought, or they have to oversee their kids' schoolwork. Many parents are not teachers. I'm not a teacher. That's a very difficult task. Many of our staff, leaders, and some of the people that we serve are also facing financial crisis. So while your staff may still be working, they could be working lesser hours because you had to keep keep the doors open. It could be that they're also in a financial crisis because their spouse has stopped working or their children who were working in retail and managing their own expenses now are not working. So staff and leaders are being impacted by the pandemic financially across the board. And then I also found that there's this disruption happening at home. There are many families who had to come together because of the pandemic. So imagine the kids came back from college. For some families, I heard that they brought their parents home into their home so that they can keep them safe. Or there are some young couples who've had to move back home because both or one person in the relationship has lost their job and they can no longer maintain their mortgage or maintain their rent. So there's a lot of disruption in what has happened. But worst of all, the pandemic has led to us losing our internal locus of control. And for many of us, it's on multiple layers, right? So it's it's not just the big main things, but it's also the little things. And we can no longer control the really, some of us can no longer control the really basic things in our lives anymore, right? So the more we're losing it, the less motivated we become. So I found these two pictures and I was drawn to them because the person on the right is who I think about when I think about people working from home, right? It's this having to juggle childcare and finding a space to work. And if you have a toddler, you can never take your eyes off of your toddler. So that toddler is literally next to you. And then not having the proper space or having temporary office space on a daily basis. Because for many of our staff, our office space is also our dining room table, or it's the kitchen table, or it's the room. And so we have to remember that many of us and many of our staff was that person on the left. We had an office, or we had a cubicle, or we had a desk. We had a place to put all of our work stuff in that was organized. We had dual monitors for many of us, or we had a bigger monitor, right? We had human interaction. So we can never forget that there was a then and there is a now. And those two pictures look very different for many of us. And it's been 7 months and many of us are still trying to figure this out. So what has changed in our work? In the previous slide, we talked about the physical workspace, but I want to talk about what's changed in our work. And then we're going to ask that you go into the chat and tell us what has changed for your specific organization. But some of the things that I'm hearing is there's a real blurriness between the boundaries of work and home. Our staff no longer know when to close it down. They're really struggling. And so 5 and 6 o'clock and 7 o'clock all just kind of looks like the same hour. There's no separation. We're not driving back home. So those lines are being blurred. And people are really struggling with that. Human interaction, we hear that a lot. We are missing each other. We are supposed to be social beings that are in constant contact with each other. We are constantly supposed to be looking in each other's eyes. Today, we're looking at a camera or we're looking at a monitor. So that human interaction, the one where we're at the coffee pot, and I give you an elbow bump because I just told you a joke or I said something funny, that's gone. All of that's gone right now. And then there's caretaking and working simultaneously. So as we saw in the picture, if you're caretaking for your child, your toddler, your teenagers who are also suffering, or your elderly parents, this is happening at the same time still, 7 months into the pandemic. Another thing that has changed about our work is that now everything is, for most staff, there's still staff doing face-to-face, but for many staff, everything is being done via computer or phone. Excuse me. And so we have this big barrier in front of us every day, and never was this supposed to happen or be this way. Again, we should be having this human interaction. And so the computer and the phone, Zoom is starting to cause Zoom fatigue. We're going to have a new disease as a result of this. People are really, really tired. But then when you use the phone, you miss out on the nonverbal cues. So it's gotten really complicated how we interact with each other. We've had to create a workspace at home. And as I mentioned before, not everybody has a permanent workspace. Many people are still juggling temporary workspaces. And by temporary, I mean they have to set it up every day and they have to break it down at the end of the day. And then lastly, some of us are still lacking essential technology. So in the beginning, a lot of organizations were wanting to make sure that everybody had a laptop. But now we're 7 months in, and staff are telling me they're missing a printer. They're telling me they cannot view or read reports on a screen, especially 7 months later. You know, imagine being an accountant or being a finance person and having to double check your Excel spreadsheets just on the screen. I am a kind of person that I print everything. If I read a report, I need to print it. And so people are starting to miss that. Let's also not assume everybody has a webcam and proper lighting. I've been told that staff get in trouble, quote unquote, in trouble. They get reprimanded because the lighting is so poor, no one can see their face. Well, lighting is another tool that they need, that they didn't need 7 months ago. And if we're gonna be here in the long term, is getting lighting to our staff, something that we can do. Before we go into the chat, because I'm interested to hear what else has changed in regard to work in your organization, I want to remind you of something. If we were just talking about a pandemic, this might be a little easier, maybe a little easier. But since March, we've had social and civil unrest due to protesting because of the murders of Black and transgender individuals. We have had 2 hurricanes in our state, and people are having to fix their homes. There have been real damages that have happened in towns where those hurricanes just tore through. And our West Coast is on fire. And many of those people are moving back with families in the East Coast. Or we have East Coast individuals having lost people in the West Coast because of these fires. So if it was just a pandemic, it would be just a little easier. But it's not just a pandemic. It's all of this. So Stephanie is going to look at the chat. Please take a moment and share what else has changed in the pandemic that is not on this list. This list represents what I hear over and over again, but we're just as interested. And then I will circle back to Stephanie in about a slide. Stephanie, are we good?
Yes, we're good. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So this is funny. I don't know if you guys know this, but when you present on Zoom, you cannot see the chat. Well, at least I can't figure out how to do that. So I need Stephanie. Thank you, Stephanie. So what do we need? And after the next slide, we're going to go back to Stephanie to check while you're chatting. So I do ask that you think about how things have changed. But what do we need? What do our staff need? And so technical support, that's the first place we went to when we told our staff that they needed to work from home. But now that we're in this for the long term, let's go back and evaluate how we set up our staff. And is it conducive to working remotely long term? So technology, I talked about laptops. That seemed to be the first thing that we naturally gravitated toward, and that made a lot of sense. But do your staff need to print things and not have a? Are we asking our staff to do things on the monitor all day? Because their eyes are being impacted and people are starting to get more and more headaches. So we want to think about that. A lot of printers come with copiers and scanners, but if you're not completely paperless, scanners become really important. Because if I have to send you a piece of paper, the only way I could do it right now is to scan it, unless I had and you had a fax machine, but that's far more outdated. Webcams. We have webcams if we have a newer laptop or we have a newer desktop. But if we don't have those things or the webcams are not working, then we need new webcams. We need better lighting and we need better Wi-Fi. So when this pandemic hit, I would have bet money that this was a 2-week thing. And so laptops were fine. You didn't need a printer. We're going to see you at the end of March, maybe the middle of April. I tell you, I would have bet money on that and I would have lost it all. But now, 7 months in, with no real idea of when this is going to end, I invite you to reevaluate what equipment your staff has and what they need. I also invite you to think about, do you have an infrastructure that supports remote work? Are you paperless? Because if you're not paperless, that's taxing the staff. I was in a conversation, I think 3 days ago, where the staff person was telling me that the intake form to get into her organization is about this thick, which is about 2 inches of paper. Federal funding, we all know what that's like. And so they're not paperless. So when they get a new client, she has to open the building. She has to set an appointment, open the building, turn on the heat or the AC, let it run a little bit, invite the family in, make sure we're all following protocols, have them fill out the paperwork, send them home, and then she shuts down the building. That has to be 4 hours of her day. Then she had to drive there and drive back home. To do one intake, this person takes an entire day, where when she was in the office, it literally just took the 2 hours that it takes to fill out the paperwork. So we're working very differently. And if you're not paperless, I want you to remember that our staff are then working twice as hard. Do you have a project management platform within your organization? And by that, I mean things like Monday.com, Basecamp, Asana, Trello. And what these project management platforms do is that they bring teams together. You can see what people are working on. You can talk about each other's work. It's a great way to hold people accountable, but it's even a better way for people to interact through work. So again, if this is because this is long term, we may want to start thinking about a project management platform. And then finally, I want to talk about supplies because I hear this a lot. So 7 months ago, I would go into Phil's supply closet and I'll get a ream of paper when I need a paper. If I needed work files, they have them. They have pens, they have everything. And then now I have to purchase everything. And so I want you to be cognizant of the fact that going out and purchasing supplies that were once available to us is also daunting to our staff. And I want you to start thinking about how little by little we've lost even the smallest bits of control. And you could see how it tears at our motivation. I'm going to pause to circle back to Stephanie and see, what are we hearing, Stephanie, on the chat?
So we're definitely hearing some things that you've already highlighted, Cynthia. And so one is that working remotely and having to deal with everything that's going on, we've kind of lost that human connection, specifically around the celebration of one's victories and accomplishments. So for example, we have an organization who is joining us today. They provide immigration legal services, and many of their staff have lost the opportunity to share in the moments of celebration with their clients around their victories. And an example that was given is that when someone comes into the office to get their green card, there's the with the pandemic and social distancing and so forth, it's made celebrating that individual and their accomplishment very hard. We also have that contacting clients and folks that an organization may work with and serve over video or on the phone, as opposed to meeting them in person, and all the difficulties that arise around connecting with someone that way, which feels very impersonal.
Yeah.
And another thing that we had that was brought up was downsizing, and having to downsize the organization when the pandemic came, and the days are longer. So days definitely feel longer, and the support staff that an organization may have, like an intern or a fellow, who've really helped a lot with some of these organizations, they're not there. And so the weight of everything falls on the staff, and that's been very difficult. Lost opportunities to grieve collectively when a company has losses. So the opposite of celebration, right? Coming together to celebrate our accomplishments, but also being able to come together in a way that just, literally together, as opposed to Zoom, to support one another and to kind of deal with grieving and with loss. We also have someone else agreeing that their day is longer. They're starting their day much earlier. Maybe that time when they would have walked out the door to get in their car to travel to the office, at that time they're working, and maybe even a little before that. A lot of questions or a lot of comments around working with clients. Staff's main job, who would have been to work with clients face to face, supporting them, supporting the client, making sure that they have all that they need. It's all done remotely and in different ways, and it's just not as effective, and it doesn't feel as supportive, and that may be causing some frustration. So we do have an organization that uses Asana for their project management.
Oh, good.
And the pace has been picked up, but it varies greatly based on an individual's comfort level with the technology,
Yes.
maybe how they were using that software prior, but especially if it's brand new, there's kind of a learning curve, right? There's the idea of learning the new software, and then also what your comfort level is. And I think that those are two different things.
Yes. Yes.
And then the need for management to emphasize and not sympathize. So this individual is a leader of a small group and does their best to motivate, but there is still a lull because staff may not feel appreciated by upper management.
Yep.
And I think being able to support one another is very difficult when it's being done remotely, especially if the staff, the management with their staff, they haven't really had a really strong, lasting relationship prior to the pandemic and all of our work changing. Work with donors and potential donors has changed without the in-person conversation and the in-person meetings. It's a challenge with the work because so many of the donors are just not email savvy and are not technologically savvy or comfortable working with all of our different web-based platforms. We do have some folks that are still going into the office because they're direct service providers. And so, just the going into the office and all that entails is very different. We have another user commenting on the use of a project management platform. They use Basecamp.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the isolation between management levels and departments. You only really interact with the people that you're that you share the same workload. And so it's not like when we were in the office where you still saw the other staff in the office, coming and going. There were those moments to touch base. And now it's really focused on who your work team is. Who are you touching base with?
Yeah, these are all good points. Stephanie, a lot of these points we're going to address in later slides, but I do want to mention two things that I do not address here that is very real, and it's the idea of downsizing and grief. The people who stay behind, meaning the ones who have not lost their job, grieve and probably suffer from survivor's guilt just as much as those who lost their job, except they're not dealing with survivor's guilt. And so grief is very real. And I'm glad somebody mentioned that because I do not talk about it. And when I work with organizations on change management, grieving becomes a part of the conversation. We need to create space for grief and have conversations about how it feels that not only did we lose our neighbor because of our workspace, but we're probably never going to hear back from them because they've been downsized. So thank you for that. So Stephanie, can we circle back a little later, maybe in the Q&A, if there's stuff that we haven't addressed?
Yes, absolutely.
Cool. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for those notes. Is really, really important. And so I'll make sure to talk about some of the things that got mentioned. So, sorry about that. So another thing that we are finding that staff need, in addition to the technical support and the technology, is communication. And communication looks very different when working with virtual teams, but definitely even more different than now because of the isolation of the pandemic and everything else happening around our nation. So some of the things that we know that's working is check in before content. There used to be a time that you can walk into a room and start a meeting. If you were that kind of person and you had that kind of organizational culture, then that was great. You walked in, you waited for everybody, and then you started with introductions or you started with the first agenda item. Well, when we're in a virtual platform or when we haven't seen each other or when we're potentially having the mental health crisis that we're having, it is advised that we check in before we go right into conversation. I know that the work is more, but it's far more meaningful to have those couple of minutes. The managing partner at FIO opens every conversation. I could call her 3 times, and every conversation is, how are you doing? That's how she starts. That's her first sentence, hands down. And if I need 20 minutes to answer that, she gives it to me. And I get that time is of essence. But if you don't do this already, because I'm sure many of you do, start your meetings with check-ins and then go into content. Increase your communication frequency. So if you are the kind of leader that you had employee newsletters and maybe 2 staff meetings a year, you may want to consider how you can communicate to your staff more often. And I have to tell you something, staff want to hear from their leaders, right? We hear from our supervisors, managers, directors, VPs all the time. But sometimes it is very comforting to hear from the CEO themselves. So if you're leading an organization, I invite you to think about that. Make some communication predictable. So people feel close when they predict the communication, right? So whether that's start a meeting every Monday, have a meeting every Monday morning at 9 a.m. every Monday, or have a weekly one-to-one meeting, or do an end of the day checkout, but make it predictable. And here's a big difference. When we were in the office, if you and I met every Thursday at 3 p.m., that was our check-in, and you had to move some things around, I probably would not have minded, right? Sometimes I may get annoyed, but I may not have minded. I really appreciate getting that extra hour or we just reschedule. And because I know how things are crazy, I can see the craziness in the office. I become more graceful around this. But I don't see the craziness. And if all I have with you is Thursday at 3 p.m. and you constantly reschedule that, I feel even more isolated. And so you might want to think about making those pockets of time with your staff sacred and minimize the rescheduling, because it amplifies the isolation. I don't know what's happening on your side, so I'm going to make assumptions you just don't want to talk to me. And now, once again, I don't get your support. Don't make it only about work. So this is where the grief can come in, right? You can have a conversation about a topic. You can do, some people are doing quote unquote happy hour. You could choose to have alcohol or not. That's not the point. Happy hour, though, is the coming together of people. I guess we'll talk about happy things in an hour, but it's the coming together of people and talking about other things than work. And so at FIO, we have a happy hour once a week where we don't talk about work. We talk about anything else. Of course, we end up talking about work, but I got to see what people are building. We share quilting stuff. We talk, we laugh. Like it's so cool to be with my teammates who I love for at least an hour a week where I just get to know them a little bit better. Change how you communicate. So I'm finding that many CEOs are doing like a Zoom check-in where anyone in the organization can come at a specific hour, let's say Monday at 10 a.m., and just hang out with the CEO. And so if that's different for you, I'm finding CEOs who are having conversations about updates on things that are going on. They're showing some vulnerability and showing that we're not the only ones that feel isolated and confused and like we've lost our, our locus of control. Or they're talking about a book that they're reading and really enjoying. So think about these things. Create a space for workplace chatter. This is what we miss, right? We miss just talking in person. I miss the elbow bump. I miss hugging people. I miss hearing about your weekend, right? And there are many platforms that help you do this. Slack, and many of these are free. Slack, Basecamp has a chat feature. Microsoft 365, I understand. I do not use it, but I understand there's a place for instant messaging. And then Google Hangout has a really cool place, excuse me, where people can just chat. And so that's really important. I learned that my coworker is having a baby because she put a picture on Slack. The funny thing is they were all dressed up in Halloween costumes and it completely went over my head. I was like, okay, that's weird. She takes a professional photo with Halloween costumes. She must be really into Halloween. Turns out that she was showing that she's having a baby. And then somebody else said, congratulations. And somebody else said, what? Congratulations for what? And it became so much fun to learn about her news through a picture and play with that. It's a great way to bring people back together. And I know he talked about Zoom fatigue, and it's a real thing, but harness the advantages of video conferencing. Video conferencing helps you see nonverbal communication a little bit better than the phone. Not as good as in person, but a little bit better. I also heard from an organization that it is a group norm that if you're going to do a Zoom meeting, you have to be dressed for work. Not dressed. You don't get to come in your pajamas. You get dressed for work. And while, again, that may be taking away some of our control, the fact of the matter is that that helps staff really feel part of a workspace and an organization. Video conferencing increases participation more now than ever. More than the phone and more than email. So if you can put it on Zoom without causing too much Zoom fatigue, think about that in terms of your teams. And lastly, and this came up in the chat, there's never been a more important time for staff recognition. So if you are the type of leader who tends to recognize staff once a year through performance appraisals, I invite you to rethink that and do it more often. If you're the type of leader that likes to praise based on big things, like when I finish a big project, I invite you to rethink that and think about the small things that you can praise staff for. You could put a sign on your wall. You could put an entry in your calendar. Say, I'm going to recognize a staff member 3 times a week, at least 3 times a week. And so that makes you start thinking about doing these things on a regular basis. Okay, I am excited now because I'm going to get to rest my voice a little bit. And we have 2 organizations. One, the person was not able to come, but I can speak on her behalf on a really innovative way that she is supporting her staff. But I've also asked, and so I'm gonna stop the screen share if that's okay. Cool. I am gonna ask Catherine Dupree to talk to us about what she's doing in her organization. Catherine leads Ben Haven, which is based in North Haven, and they are an organization, I think, of about 300 staff, some who already work
Yes.
remotely, and who work with individuals with intellectual disabilities. And her staff had really had to put things in motion quickly when the pandemic hit. Catherine and I speak all the time, and she's always telling me these great things that staff have done. So Catherine, tell us a little bit about some of the things that's happening at Ben Haven in terms that's helping staff stay motivated.
I'll be happy to. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
All right. Well, thank you for including me, and so many things of the things that Cynthia has said we have either put into place or we certainly will, because she's really helped us motivate staff in terms of our communication. Just to add a little bit to her introduction about Ben Haven, we do serve people with intellectual disabilities, and really our specialty is autism services. And we serve people from 3 years of age through the end of life. So we provide residential services, in-home family support services, and we offer 2 schools for students with autism. So we had a range of different issues to deal with, different effects of closure and different effects of needing to stay opened. But I really want to talk about motivation around 4 areas. One is through communication. One is through thanks and acknowledgement. Another, as Cynthia's talked about, is through involvement in decision-making. And the last is through education and support. Ours was a very siloed organization because our services are so different. So we really brought senior leaders together on a much more regular basis than we used to do. And we started out by meeting weekly, and then we went to bi-weekly. And those senior managers replicated that kind of communication with their own staff. And everybody became very comfortable using Zoom. As we were able to, people as much as possible also did outdoor staff meetings for staff because people really missed that personal interaction. So I think that regular communication, people communicating with each other in a much more direct and frequent way, staff being able to bring up their own concerns about COVID and have those addressed with their peers as well as their supervisors helped us incredibly. We really also tried to do a lot of thanks and acknowledgement for staff. We had residential programs that obviously stayed open. We have 8 group homes. We had no outbreak of COVID for either residents or staff in those settings, and considered that to be an incredible blessing. And we also have staff who work directly in people's homes, and we can control those settings with a lot less ability than we can our group homes. So we did a couple of things to thank staff. We gave supplemental pay for any staff who had to continue to work directly during the clear outbreak of COVID, and then when they were working with participants and working with families. And we did those supplemental pays each month, and we sent people a thank you letter also for their engagement, because we really felt that their personal self-discipline in their own life and their life with their families was contributing to them being able to maintain themselves as a healthy staff person for us. And that was an incredible gift that they gave to people who otherwise life would have fallen apart for without their services. We also did sporadic but frequent gifts of brought in lunches and dinners for staff in our group home settings. And we honored all of our direct support professionals in September with gift cards and thank you pens and homemade and stop-ins where they worked, because they really are the essence of what we do. So I think that that proved to be very helpful. People appreciated those thanks and that acknowledgement. And we did write-ups on our website when people had accomplished particular things for individuals with whom they worked. Cynthia talked a lot about giving control over to people and involving them in decision-making. I think for us to motivate staff, that was clear. There was so much confusion and uncertainty in the beginning about how we would even proceed to provide services, how we would feel safe, both our staff and the people we serve. And while we tried as senior managers to work with our medical director and listen to the advice of CDC and DPH, there were always nuances to those decisions in particular homes or for families. So we really tried to give control as much as possible to the staff who were involved. So in our group home settings, staff really contributed to the decisions about how we would change activities for people when they were much more isolated and couldn't be in the community. And we let staff really determine a safe re-entry for people into their community life. In individual and family support services, we had staff with even more trepidation because, again, they were in family homes where they couldn't control the safety of those settings in the same ways we can in our group homes. For those staff, we sort of defined those people who absolutely had an essential service from us and couldn't survive without that direct support person being with them. And that may be a person with a disability who lives on their own and needs food shopping or really needs help with daily tasks. But for other people for whom that wasn't such an essential service, we engaged the staff in how best to serve that person. And we went to remote learning and instruction with people when we could. We went to telehealth techniques, and we really listened to staff in making the decisions about that, how that would work the best. The other thing we did in terms of giving control was we had to close both of our schools rapidly in March, as all other schools did. Our staff worked very hard and were offering remote learning within a week of those closures, and we were very impressed with their work. But Cynthia mentioned those people who have school-age children at home or toddlers for whom the parents' supervision and attention was pretty critical during the day. So for those staff who were working on lesson plans or whose one-to-one support for an individual might work in an evening, we really allowed that moderation and that flexibility for people's schedules. And I think that helped because those people felt they had a bit more control over their own schedules. The other thing that we did was a lot of education and support. Cynthia talked about technology. We had just been in a place where we were adding a lot of computers and replacing new computers with older computers. We took all of those and gave those to staff to use at home. So for those teachers who had to instruct students and didn't have technology, we gave them laptops. We gave their paraprofessionals iPads, and we gave those same supplies to our behaviorists. And that made an incredible difference for them to feel that they still had to learn how to use all that technology and work remotely. They were used to working in person, but they had the devices they needed. And I think people felt supported by that. And the last thing we did around education and support was we used the time that some of our staff had because their work, their direct work was halted for a period of time to invest in training. We kept all of our staff on payroll. Normally, I'm sure all of you who run agencies feel you don't have enough time to offer the training that you would want to. We particularly, because of our population of people with autism, believe in behavior technology and behavior training techniques. So we really used that time that they had, that they used to only be devoting to direct support work or educational intervention with students, to let them participate in online training. And through our clinicians, we provided the clinical supervision they needed if they were trying to go for their RBT program. So I think that all that made staff feel as supported as possible. We communication survey in the late part of the summer to see were any of these techniques working. So we asked people about the value of the communication we did through our website, the communication we do through our payroll system. I, as the executive director, also did much more regular written communication with staff. And we asked about the value of the Zoom supervisory meetings. We got incredibly positive feedback, which was great, but I think people also appreciated the opportunity to be asked. And what's come out of that survey that we will change is these ideas, which is that while people appreciated regular written communication from me as the executive, they really responded positively when asked if they would like regular Zoom check-in calls. So we're starting to offer those at the end of this month, and we'll do those quarterly, and those will be open to all staff. So Cynthia, I think I covered the topics that we've introduced, but we've just been, our staff, it's really resonated for our staff, and people have been incredibly positive through all this.
I can echo that. Working with Catherine's team has been amazing. I started working with them before the pandemic, and then when we got into the pandemic, and I still talk to Catherine now 7 months later, and her management staff they made a decision, probably innately, organically, to make it about employees first and really care for their employees. So the management team, I do not sense that they are burdened by this. They actually enjoy talking to their team more. They're really making sure that they make these meetings and that they stick to the meetings. And when I talk to the staff, everyone says the same thing. We've upped our communication. We listen to our staff. We're trying to find ways to engage them. So I'm not surprised, Catherine, that your survey said, thank you for the written stuff, but I also want to see you in person or through Zoom. These days, in person means through Zoom. So I'm not surprised by that. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for that. And there was another person who was not able to make it. And she is the VP of HR at an organization in Boston. And what she found was that they had to, quote unquote, force their staff to take vacation. Because staff decided, a lot of staff were like, why would I take vacation? I'm home anyway, right? I have nowhere to go. But they needed to take it or lose it. And so there was really a push for that. What happened when staff came back is that they started reporting to HR that really was not helpful. And that in fact, they found that they came back to even more work because now everybody does everything by email. So where you may have come back to 200 emails after your vacation, now people were coming back 600 emails. And she kept hearing this over and over and over again. And what this organization decided to do is that they will be shutting down the last week of the year. The entire organization shuts down for 1 week and everybody takes their vacation. And the idea is hopefully no one comes back to 600 emails. You'll have emails from the external world, but no one will be working that week. And so what they're doing is really implementing what I call structural care, where the organization is listening to the employees and trying to support them in little ways. Now, some of you may wonder, I would love to do that, but I already give my staff way too many days off. We have a lot of work. I do want to say that in exchange for the week off, they did take back some of the random days off that are going to come in 2021. Not all of them. So it's not like they lose 5 holidays and now they get a week off. I think they exchanged 3 holidays and then gave 2 extra days. And it's 1 week at the end of the year so that staff also get to enjoy end of the year holidays. So though I found that to be extremely innovative, but it's also rooted in the fact that this person surveyed the staff. She started hearing something and documenting it, and then went up to the leaders, and they were able to find a solution. So I'm going to go back to screen sharing. Oh, now I got to figure this out. Okay, let me just, I missed a slide. Okay. Okay, so we were gonna go into breakout rooms, but Stephanie, I'm gonna hold off on the breakout rooms because I wanna spend some time on questions and answers because I saw the chat and there's a lot of good stuff there. So we're not gonna have a breakout, we'll actually bring that exercise at the end. So Catherine spoke about taking a survey. She calls it a pulse survey. I told you about the other organization in Boston who didn't do a formal survey at that time, but she started documenting people.
Cynthia, we're having a little trouble.
I'm sorry?
I think maybe Jackie was getting ready to say that there was some trouble with the audio.
Do you hear me?
I hear you.
Yeah, I see some heads nodding.
Okay. So I'm not sure if it was a connection on Jackie's end. If
Oh,
anyone
okay.
it is having a hard time with the audio, please feel free to unmute yourself so that you can let us know that there's difficulties. Also, you could send it through in the chat. I am monitoring the chat.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you for telling me that. Okay, so Kathleen said that it did cut out, but it came back. Okay, cool. So let me just do my my share screen. And then view. Okay. I lost my presenter view, so I just have to slide. Okay. Okay, I'll figure this out. So Catherine called it a pulse survey, and the other organization started documenting when people would come and complain about their vacation experience, right? And so another thing that leaders could be doing is taking these pulse surveys throughout the year. I know the way I felt about the pandemic 7 months ago has changed about how I feel about it now. And so if you are the type of organization that assesses your staff once a year, I invite you to think about doing it at least 3 times a year, every 4 months, until we have a sense of what normal is going to look like again, right? But our staff needs are changing, and checking in with them becomes really important. Here are some things that I've learned asking staff, and they've changed through time. So this is not one point in time, right? The staff are complaining about too many meetings. I don't know if that's because we need to make sure that staff are working, but that seems to be the #1 complaint. So be mindful of the meetings that you're holding. Staff still need time to do work. Staff are having trouble creating a workflow or a schedule because they lack the equipment, because they're not completely paperless, because they've had to make adaptations that make their work harder. I'm also hearing staff want to hear from their leaders. Their leaders are way too busy, and I get it. This is really hard work, and no one has a toolkit to tell you how to do it. But your staff need you. They need to check in with you. They need you to respond to emails. They need to talk with you. Access to information. Now imagine we don't have access to our servers. If you use a VPN system, that's never fun. Somebody told me, I went out to dinner with someone the other day, and they said that they were told they had to leave the office and by email, and they couldn't come back the next day, and the files are in their office, and they're just so lost without their paperwork. So find ways to give access to staff and start documenting processes on either your intranet or some kind of portal. Staff are feeling isolated. I hear that whether it was March or now in September. Staff are really, and I think the isolation is actually getting worse. And be mindful of the winter months. And we're changing our time pretty soon. So that's going to come up with another challenge. There's shaming around distractions for some people that we want to be mindful of. We are in people's homes. And so you're going to see their dog, you're going to see their spouses, you're going to see their children. But you want to be careful not to frown upon the interruptions too much, unless it's an interruption that is so bad it's hindering work. But how much can we control that our toddler is having a breakdown right now? There's not much we can control. We can end the meeting and do it another time. But I just want leaders to be mindful of that, because I understand that that's aggravating, but the shaming is really impacting our staff. Like Catherine said, we need more training. If you took your organization from being live to being virtual, trust me, there still has to be a lot of training that happens. 7 months in, and I know people who do not know how to navigate Zoom. So people could use training. Think about that. It is a new way of working. And micromanaging. I know there are some people who choose to micromanage as a leadership style. It doesn't work in a virtual environment. All the literature hands down says that micromanaging, in fact, does not help. And we need to talk about building trust. One of the things that I do want you to do is sorry, I'm just monitoring. Okay. Is I want to hear what you are hearing from your staff about challenges in terms of the pandemic and having to manage all of this. And if you could put that in the chat, we will address this toward the end. But is there something in this list that is not here that you have heard from your staff? And then managing remote staff takes a different leadership style. All of the literature in the research says you cannot be the same leader in person as you are managing a virtual team. And so what does that look like? Well, there is a researcher called Macarius who has spent her many years researching global virtual teams. And now she's doing it in the COVID context. And she talks about how task significance, which remember we talked about that, finding meaning, autonomy, and feedback actually mitigate the negative effects of isolation. So the same thing we've been hearing from Charles Duhigg and the research that he's been investigating. We are hearing it from someone who's dedicated her life to also doing that kind of research. And so if your style pre-pandemic leaned toward micromanaging, or you only provided feedback during appraisal times, I want you to rethink that, because jobs that are empowering and have meaning, give our staff autonomy, and have extreme impact are more effective in a virtual environment. Macarius also talked about this concept that she coined called virtual intelligence. And it is about how do we develop our individuals to succeed in a virtual work environment? So I found this to be relevant for leaders, but also for staff. So virtual intelligence is about recognizing that a virtual work environment is different from office work settings, right? So it is about knowing about the technology and being able to filter the technological and other distractions and focusing on what's important, right? So leaders can take a lesson in this. Like, let's start focusing on what's really important and bring our staff into that. Let's reprioritize. Let's talk to our board members and say, we're going to have to push that plan a year out, because we We just need to focus on these things. Understanding that our environment and state is very different. Higher level constructs, which is how we understand the world. The more likely a person is to make sense of what's happening, the more successful they will be in a virtual environment. Leaders can help their staff talk through that. Try to make sense of this pandemic, put it into context, make it manageable. Find those little locuses of control, loci of control. And then task and attention shifting. We all have problems with this. It's very hard for me to go from task to task to task. But in a virtual environment, you are often likely to do it more. So you want to help your staff in these areas and raise their virtual intelligence. Directing resources through planning and reasoning to influence virtual work behaviors. I encourage teams to develop new group norms, right? The organization that says you have to be dressed for work to come to a Zoom meeting. I know another organization that wants everybody to be on video, right? They don't want to see your picture. They want you to be live. And so these are group norms that if you co-create them with your staff, and they feel they had a say in it, much what Catherine was talking about, then they're more likely to follow these rules, right? Intentionally building trust. This is a big difference in our work virtually because trust is built through face-to-face interactions. And so building it virtually takes other skills. And then determining the best move for communication, which I've already talked about. But doing these things helps elevate our virtual intelligence and leads us and our staff to success. And then we cannot forget information management. That is updating your knowledge. We're doing things differently. You want to document your processes and update them so that you can also do knowledge transfer in a much easier way. And knowledge transfer is because somebody leaves or you found a staff member whose work is no longer essential, but you want to keep that staff person and move them someplace else. For example, your front desk person whose job was to greet people. You want to keep that person. Well, now you're going to need to find a role for them and train them. And that's what I mean by knowledge transfer. These three categories, according to Macarius, leads to greater virtual intelligence and helps leaders and staff to be more successful in their work. We have 2 more slides and then I'm going to open it to questions and also see what you've been putting in the chat in terms of what are you hearing from your staff? And I apologize for the cough. Okay, so supporting staff. I'm sorry, did I not have that? Stephanie, can you tell me, did I not have that slide up when I was talking just now? The virtual one?
No, it was the virtual one wasn't up.
Was not up. Okay, I apologize for that, everybody. So these are the 3 categories that Macarius talked about in terms of virtual intelligence. So when the slides become available, you may want to review those because there's some really good stuff there. But in the interest of time, I'm going to go into the next slide and then I have one more after this. And I really want to hear from you. So how can we support staff? Well, it's interesting, but this concept of temporary office space, right? So there are staff that have to set up and break down every day because their office is also their dining room, their kitchen, or their family room. So be aware that if your staff needs to set up and if they need to break down, maybe starting a meeting at 9 is not a good idea unless you start your day at 8:30. Maybe ending a meeting at 5 is not a good idea either, unless the end of the day is 6 p.m. Be cognizant that setup and breakdown is part of their process. The power of policies. This is very interesting. When I got into HR, my number 1 phone call request was, do we have a policy on this? What's the policy on this? And one day I asked, I said, why do people keep asking for policies? What is it in this piece of paper that makes it so important? Excuse me. And someone said, policies guide how to do something. There's a lot of power in policies. It helps staff navigate through the complexity of managing their people. So don't forget your policies. Again, not so much to restrict them, invite your staff to update them. Give them some control over that. But you don't want to update them and then put them out there and people feel even more loss of control. Create short performance management updates. Feedback and praise is critical. You could do it every 3 months. It doesn't have to be a big hoopla, but just sit with your staff and talk about their performance, how well they're doing, what they think their challenges are, and how you can help them. Adapt your organizational culture. Really look at how you operate in the office and how that needs to change online. Be more available. We talked about that. Offer more training because although the work has gone virtual, we didn't work virtually 7 months ago. And document your processes. We just talked about that. How, excuse me, how we have to make sure that the new way of working also gets documented. And then my last slide, and thank you so much for your attention. We started this presentation talking about how to keep our staff motivated. And so I wanted to end it and bring you back to the beginning. One of the things you could do is talk to your staff about motivation and talk to them about the part of the brain if you want to do that, but also this idea of choice making and how they feel about losing the locus, their internal locus of control because of the pandemic. Find a place that you can help them get that back. Provide them with choice making. Even if it's they get to choose their team member, their teammate for a project. Small choices, remember, really small choices ignites that part of the brain. Get rid of micromanaging. It doesn't work in the virtual world. Create a space for rule breaking. I told you I would come back to this. This is really important to let people break rules and not constantly reprimand them. If they're breaking small rules, smile internally to yourself the way you would to a child because you know what they're doing, right? Choices, not orders. And then remind staff of the why. And most of you have staff who have made a commitment to the vision and mission of your organization. And that is like gold. Remind them of that even though we are all impacted by the crises, that their work is still important to get us through. And the way we're gonna do that is to help them through motivation. I hope this helped in some way. We're gonna open it up to questions or see the comments in the chat. And I'm gonna stop sharing, Stephanie.
Okay, so we did have a few comments come in through the chat.
Yeah.
So there, folks were sharing some of their experiences around working with staff in these very difficult times. And one organization mentioned the need for staff to pay to upgrade their internet service. And something that you touched upon, Cynthia, young adult staff needing to supervise their younger siblings as their parents are working either outside of the home or working from home. This idea that there's not enough recognition or acknowledgement, and there's a lot of focus on problem solving. Also, in checking in with staff, all of the staff have different personalities and are coming from different places, and they'll often say that they're fine and they don't need anything, but the supervisors can really tell that staff aren't really feeling very good and are just going through some tough times and are trying to support them even when the staff are saying that they're fine. And supervisors themselves are having a hard time staying motivated and because their feelings of being overwhelmed and increased work expectations.
Yeah.
This idea of upper management, or one individual sharing that the upper management at their organization is very political and prioritizes some groups over others, and that gets very messy, and lots of micromanaging and so forth. I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah.
So that's what we have that came through the chat. If anybody else would like to share, please, you could send it into the chat. You could also unmute yourself.
Yes, yes, please. We have about 1 minute left, but I can stay after also. So, but definitely if you want to unmute and ask your question, that's great. If you need to leave, I completely understand. You probably have another Zoom meeting as I do in an hour. But yes, all these comments are very valid. And this idea that he talked about paying staff to upgrade their internet service. So I know that nonprofits are also suffering financially, and I am not going to recommend that you go deeper into your hole. But if you are not using your space, if you're thinking about giving up your space because you don't need it or you're not going to need it for a long time, you might want to think, is there an opportunity to allocate resources toward your staff so that they can get the infrastructure in their home set up in a way that helps them? I've had to build that in my home, and it's very expensive to have fast internet. It's very, very expensive. So I think that's a great idea. If that's something your nonprofit can do, I want to be sensitive to how nonprofits are hurting. Yeah, and then micromanaging. Myra LaSalle Kaplan talked about micromanaging. I have to tell you, I've been studying a lot of this through the literature, and there is no space for micromanaging, and there's no other way to. It doesn't work in a virtual environment. It would require for you to be in contact with your staff way too much. It is demoralizing. It'll be challenging for you to get your work done. And what leaders should be focusing on is building trust and finding ways to build that trust. If you tend to be a micromanager, you're probably low on the trust. So find ways to build that for your team. Manage the outcome, not the process. Forget about how many steps it takes to get there. Manage their outcome. That's a lot easier.
I just
Thank
want
you,
to
Stephanie.
Thank you, Cynthia. I just want to, we're 1 minute past 11. I want to thank everyone who was able to join us this morning and for staying on. If you do, if you need to go, please, please feel free. Definitely take care of your needs. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. Thank you to Cynthia. It was a
Thank
great,
you.
and I think we all learned a lot.
Oh, thank you. And Stephanie, you're a great co-pilot. I so enjoy you. And Jackie, thank you for your vision. This was awesome. This was just as much fun for me. So I hope people had fun. So thank you. And I see Stephanie Plood. I used to work with Stephanie. I see Myra